Welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and I'm going to be talking about the best commanders from March of the Machine Aftermath. Just a really tiny set. They dropped the whole set on us last week, all at once. It's only 50 cards, but besides the fact that it's such a small set, there is still 22 commanders. So almost half the set is actually commanders, which is pretty crazy. So I'm going to be talking about the 10 best commanders from that set. In my opinion, I always like the interesting build-arounds, of course. So let's get to it. I'm going to start out with an honorable mention, which is Jirina, Dauntless General. And I had considered even giving this a mention on my best cards from the set. I usually don't like to include commanders there. So I'm going to give it a mention here. White and a black, Human Soldier 2/2. When Jirina, Dauntless General enters the battlefield, exile target player's graveyard. Sacrifice Jirina. Humans you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. I don't think this is a particularly great commander. That's why I'm giving it an honorable mention. However, I think it's a great 99 card. I think this can very easily slot into the 99 of a whole lot of decks. If you're in any human tribal deck at all, it's an auto include. If you're in these colors, obviously, not only is it graveyard hate, it is I protect my whole team, which in a creature strategy, you're always going to want. I love utility creatures like this that are giving you things when they ETB. Then you can sacrifice them to give you something else. You can get them back out of the graveyard, possibly reuse them again. You always need graveyard hate in your commander decks, and you always need protection in your commander decks as well. So this is doing both, which I really, really like. Even if you just have a black-white deck where your commander is a human, I think it is certainly worth putting this in there. You have a creature that hates on graveyards, and then also you can use it to sacrifice and protect your commander from pretty much any removal as well. Really great card in the 99, I think. All right, getting to the list, coming in at number 10, Tazri, Stalwart Survivor. And I'm breaking with tradition here because it's the first time I've ever mentioned a 5-color commander on one of my lists. I'm making an exception here because I think this is a really interesting one. 2 and a white, Human Warrior 3/3. Each creature you control has tap, add 1 mana of any of this creature's colors. Spend this mana only to activate an ability of a creature. Activate only if this creature has another activated ability. And you can pay Wooburg and tap, mill 5 cards, put all creature cards with activated abilities that aren't mana abilities from among the milled cards into your hand. So I don't typically love 5-color commanders, but this one is so interesting. I love that first ability. And for me, when I'm finding interesting commanders to build around, one of the things I look for is let's do a deep dive and find all those old interesting cards that might fit really nicely into this strategy. You're looking for creatures that you want to add mana of their colors. So maybe you want creatures with a lot of colors, and you also need creatures with activated abilities, but you don't really want them to be mana abilities. I mean, they can, but that's not going to play into the last ability, right? I like the stipulation there that they added on that last one that don't have mana abilities. So that encourages people to not just shoehorn a bunch of mana dorks in their deck. You got to find the creatures with the interesting mana abilities. Then, of course, you got to use the mana you're getting for those abilities that those creatures have. I just really, really like the interesting directions you can go with this commander. And this really feels like one of those commanders that when you sit down at a table, you never know what you're going to get. You're going to get a whole bunch of creatures with all these wacky, weird activated abilities. I think it's a pretty interesting one for sure. Coming in at number 9 is Sigarda, Font of Blessings. 2 green and a white. Angel 4/4 flying. Other permanents you control have hexproof. You may look at the top card of your library at any time, and you may cast angel spells and human spells from the top of your library. So I sort of hummed and hawed about this one a little bit. You have those first 2 abilities, like I talked about in the spoiler video, that is fantastic in any deck. Having your permanents get hexproof is great, and being able to look at the top card of your library is always super handy. You can build this deck around just that. Just I'm playing off the top of my library and not do the human angel tribal stuff at all. Although angels and humans are really, really popular creature types in the format, so it's not that difficult. I mean, even if you weren't trying to, even if you just put a, whatever deck together, it's likely you're going to have a human in that deck and probably an angel as well that you can play off the top. You don't really need to play into it at all. It's a nice little advantage that you can have. I can play angels and humans off the top of my library. I wouldn't maybe look at that too much though. I really like those first two abilities more. Like I talked about in the spoiler video, you can do a hate bear strategy here, which I think is pretty good. A lot of angels and humans are hate bears, and giving them a hexproof, of course, is great because your opponents are going to want to get them off the table. But just good stuff, angels and humans, right? And, you know, playing two tribes at once isn't really that, you know, super advantageous. It can be really difficult because if I have something that gives all humans +1/+1, I'm not going to give my angels +1/+1. So I wouldn't go that direction. I wouldn't go the typical tribal direction of, I'm going to put all those anthem effects that are going to be giving anthems to my creatures. I wouldn't do that. There are a few cards already, like the Sigardas, for example, that want you to be playing angels and humans. So those for sure you can put in here. But I would just play, you know, probably good stuff angels, good stuff humans, a little of both. And then you get those nice advantages as well. Really great commander. Coming in at number 8, Plargg and Nassari, 3 red, Orca-Freed, 5/4. At the beginning of your upkeep, each player exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card. An opponent chooses a non-land card exiled this way. You may cast up to 2 spells from among the other cards exiled this way without paying their mana cost. So this is just really fun, interesting, sort of political commander that I really like this a lot. There's not a ton of build around here, so maybe I'm breaking with tradition a little bit, where I usually go after the commanders that have interesting build arounds. This is just a really great open-ended mono red commander that I think you could do a lot with. I don't know if there's a particular theme here other than I'm playing stuff from exile, and there is a little bit of I play stuff from exile support that could go in here. There is a little bit of I'm playing my opponent's stuff maybe that you could use here, but red does this a lot. Of course, Atali is one of those commanders that people have been doing this a lot with, where I'm just playing everyone else's stuff. I'm getting random things off of my opponents. This is just a great commander that is doing that, and I really like the politics aspect there. It's not only a politics aspect, but is also a, you know, it powers down a little bit, where if you happen to get that expropriate off the top of someone's library, your opponent can choose that, so you don't get to play it, right? So that's really important as well, I think. I really like the design here. Really, really fun commander. Coming in at number 7, Kiora, Sovereign of the Deep, 3 green and a blue Merfolk Noble 4/5 with Vigilance and Ward 3. And I always like that ward, or, you know, some sort of protection on your commander so it doesn't get removed right away. Whenever you cast a Kraken, Leviathan, Octopus, or Serpent spell from your hand. Really need to just call that sea monsters or something, because they always combine these. Look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the spell's mana value. You may cast a spell with mana value less than X from among them without paying its mana cost. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in random order. So we've seen quite a few of these commanders. You know, they've been doing this, not a lot, but quite a bit in recent years, where they're trying to make this sea monster commander. And I think this is the best. I think they did a really good job here. And the reason why is because they're encouraging you. You know, one of the drawbacks of playing the sea monster tribal is they're all really expensive. It's kind of a drawback, but here you're giving you an advantage to it. They're encouraging you to play those 6 or 7 or 8 mana Krakens or Octopuses and put them in your deck, because you're getting a really nice advantage off of them, right? You're going to look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the spell's mana value. So if I cast an 8 mana Kraken, I'm going to look at the top 8 cards of my library and cast a spell with mana value less than X from among them. So you're sort of getting a cascade effect here, right? You're sort of giving your sea monsters a cascade effect, although you can cast anything, right? You may cast a spell with mana value less than X from among them without paying its mana cost. So you're allowed to cast anything from among them. And that's going to be, I mean, obviously you're going to hit something. You're guaranteed in the top. You know, if I cast a 6, let's be a little more reasonable. If I cast a 6 mana value sea monster, when I look at the top 6 cards, I'm guaranteed going to find a card that costs 6 mana value or less, right? So I'm going to be able to cast something for sure. Whiffing is, you know, I always hate when you whiff on your commander's ability. That's almost certainly not going to happen here. And again, the reason why is because you're going to be casting those expensive things. I like the ward here because, again, this is a little bit of a slower deck where I got to get my commander out first. It costs 5, and then I got to start casting those really expensive things, which I probably won't be doing until, you know, I probably only will be doing maybe once a turn. So I like that your commander has the ward 3, so it's not going to get removed right away. I think they did a really good job at making a sea monster tribal commander here. Coming in at number 6, Nixilis Captive Kingpin, 2 black red. Demon 4/3 flying and trample. Whenever one or more opponents each lose exactly 1 life, put a +1/+1 counter on Nixilis Captive Kingpin. Exile the top card of your library until your next end step. You may play that card. So I really like this commander, obviously. That's why I'm talking about it. What I don't love about it is they're starting to do the impulse draw thing a lot. Man, they're doing it a lot. There's even quite a few commanders from this set where they're doing it. Like when you look at commander design, typically what you see is whenever this thing happens, usually there's a triggered ability. And whenever you do that, you get some payoff. And the payoff is either typically like a draw card, or it's a +1/+1 counter, or it's an impulse draw. They're really starting to do the same things over and over again a lot, which I don't love. However, the build around here is why I really like this commander. You want your opponents to be losing exactly 1 life, which I think is pretty interesting. I compared this to Gearson Starn, similar, where you want to do exactly 1 damage with Gearson Starn. Here you want to lose exactly 1 life, your opponents anyway. And of course, again, the deep dive, that's what I really like. It's not that hard to have your opponents lose exactly 1 life. You can just attack them with a creature, right? I can just have my creature attack them, hit them for 1 damage, and they will lose exactly 1 life, and that will trigger my commander. But of course, there's lots of other really interesting ways to do that. You can do like a pestilence type of effect where you're just activating that and doing damage to your opponents. You can do a mana barbs type of effect. That's a really interesting one that your opponents aren't going to like too much. Your commander is going to get massive. You're going to be doing all sorts of impulse draw, getting lots of advantage there. It is an interesting commander. And again, one of those ones where I think people will go in a lot of different directions, and not all of these decks are going to look the same. All right, moving on. We got Jolrael, Voice of Zhalfir, 2 green and a blue human druid 3/3. At the beginning of combat on your turn, up to 1 target land you control becomes an XX green and blue bird creature with flying and haste until end of turn, where X is the number of cards in your hand. It's still a land. Whenever a land creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So we have a pretty great lands creature commander here, right? Which is something that I think we don't really have. And it's kind of nice that they have it. There is a lot of interesting cards. Again, I like when they make a commander where I have a lot of these old interesting cards that don't get a lot of love that now I can shoehorn into this deck. That's what I like about commanders like this. It's a little on the nose. That's what I don't love about commanders like this, where it's super obvious what you want to be doing here. I'm turning my creatures into lands and I'm attacking with them. That part I don't love. I do love the part, though, where I got all these old interesting cards that I can now use in this deck that will fit really, really well. Again, we have the whenever this thing happens and the payoff is draw a card, which we're sort of doing that again. But I like the way they did it. You know, you are turning a land into a creature. It's a bird creature. Obviously, it's got flying, so it's going to be getting in for damage really, really easily. And X is the number of cards in your hand. So you do want a lot of cards in your hand, which probably in a Simic deck isn't going to be very difficult. I also don't love that they gave it haste. I don't know why they needed to do that. Giving haste is not something you see a lot in blue and green colors, and there's no need for it to have haste, because if it's a land that's been on the battlefield since your last turn, it's not going to have summoning sickness anyway, so you can attack with it right away. Despite all the negative things I'm saying about this commander, I actually think it's a pretty good commander for that particular build around, right? Again, we haven't had a really great sort of I want my creatures to be lands commander. I mean, maybe a couple, but this one probably is the best. I think for sure people are going to go after it for that reason. All right, coming in at number 4, Narset, Enlightened Exile, 1 blue, red, and a white, human monk 3/4. Creatures you control have prowess, which is certainly something that you can build around in this deck. But you're going to want to more build around this last ability. Whenever Narset Enlightened Exile attacks, exile target non-creature non-land card with mana value less than Narset's power from a graveyard and copy it. You may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. So, as I talked about in the spoiler video, and it's very important wording here, you are exiling a card from the graveyard. That card goes into exile. Then you are creating a copy of the exiled card and you are casting it. Now, of course, you don't have to pay the mana cost, but you are still casting it. All that wording is really important with regards to certain interactions. I am casting the card, but I'm not casting the original, and I'm not copying the original as a spell. So a twinning staff does not work here because I'm copying a card, I'm not copying a spell. That is the important sort of interaction that needs to be known here when you're building this deck, because there's a lot going on here and there's a lot you can build around, which is why I like this commander. You know, when I first saw it, I'm like, okay, they're just doing the Narset thing, but a little different. But this is a really unique commander because, of course, you can target cards in anyone's graveyard, which is really, really important. There is a lot of different reasons why you might want to do that. Because you are targeting people's cards in their graveyard, it is graveyard hate, sort of. You know, that can be important. You are probably going to want to be targeting your own graveyard here mostly, because then I can be looting maybe. But you don't really need to do any looting because, of course, you can just cast your spells normally. Then they'll go to your graveyard and you can use them again. It'll sort of be like a flashback thing. Obviously, you can increase your commander's power here. You can do so with the prowess because your commander's going to have prowess. But you can also do so in other ways where I can put like a Hammer and Nazan on my commander, then it's indestructible. That's great. Also increases its power. So now I can get bigger things out of my graveyard. Are you going to be wanting to put expensive cards in this deck at all, right? As far as mana value goes, am I only going to be wanting to put things that are maybe like 3-4 mana value so that I can guaranteed be getting stuff out of my graveyard all the time? Maybe you can do extra combats here. That's going to be good, of course, because your commander has an attack trigger. And there's also a couple other neat cards that want to be increasing their power that can certainly fit in this deck as well. I think it's a really interesting one. This one, I'm really curious how popular it's going to be. It is a pretty great Spellslinger commander in general in Jeskai colors. There's probably already some better ones in Jeskai colors that are going to be more powerful for sure than this one if you just want to be doing a Jeskai Spellslingers theme. This one's pretty interesting though, and I'm curious to see how many people will go after it. All right, coming in at number 3, Samut, Vizier of Nakdamun. 1 red and a green, human warrior, cleric, 2/3. First strike, vigilance, and haste. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, if that creature entered the battlefield this turn, draw a card. So again, I don't love that they're doing the, whenever this thing triggers, you get a card draw. You know, I would like to see something a little different. However, it is really nice as a build around when you're building your deck. And of course, you need card draw in your commander deck. And if your commander's doing it, that makes the deck building process a lot easier because you don't have to worry about it nearly as much. I like how they did this though. This isn't super obvious how you're going to be drawing the cards or what you're going to be doing. I think maybe the most obvious route here is because you want creatures that have entered the battlefield this turn to be dealing damage. Haste creatures, right? My creature enters the battlefield, it attacks right away. I connect, I draw a card. Of course, just because your creature has haste doesn't mean it's going to be connecting though, right? If I have a 2/2 creature with haste, it enters the battlefield and I attack with it, my opponent can just block. So I'm not getting anything out of that. And now what do I have? Now I have a creature, maybe it died in combat, or maybe it's just sitting there. It's already entered the battlefield. Now what am I going to do? So if your thinking is I'm just going to fill this deck full of haste creatures, I don't think that's the best route to go with this. As I talked about in the spoiler video, there's a lot of more interesting ways you can go with it. You can do the token creation thing, right? This doesn't say non-token. A token creation theme where I can create a token copy of a creature I already have, or a creature that has entered the battlefield, maybe with Flame Shadow Conjuring, where I create another token copy of it. Also the I'm just creating tokens, like all those little elemental haste tokens. There's lots of cards in red particularly that are doing that. I just create a whole bunch of little hasty token creatures that I can just fling at my opponents. They're probably going to get sacrificed or exiled on the end step anyway, so I don't really care because I'm going to do it again the next turn. That strategy also works really well here. And ninjutsu, you know, the few, I think maybe there's 4 creatures in Gruul colors that have ninjutsu that can fit this strategy. That will work here. And it works particularly well with the haste creatures because, of course, I can play the haste creature. It has entered the battlefield. I attack, I draw a card. But then now what do I do with it? Now I can pick it up, put an ninjutsu creature down. That gets me a card draw, and then I can replay the haste creature, which will get me a card draw once again. So even though it is, whenever I deal damage with my creatures, I get to draw a card, which is a little on the boring side, they're doing it in a very interesting way where you got to put some thought into it. It's not super obvious how this deck is going to work, I think. All right, coming in at number 2 is Karn, Legacy Reforged. That's right. This commander might seem a little boring for some people, but I think it's a pretty neat one. And I finally found a commander that I might go after as far as building a colorless deck, because I have always wanted to build a colorless deck. It is a really neat deck building challenge in my opinion. So 5 mana legendary artifact creature golem, and it has power and toughness, each equal to the greatest mana value among artifacts you control. So of course, if this is your only artifact in play, it's going to be a 5/5 because it includes itself. In fact, it's Never really going to be lower than a 5/5. It's only going to be higher than that. There's not really a lot to build around there. I certainly would not try to just shoehorn a bunch of really expensive artifacts into this deck just to make my commander's power and toughness bigger. It's just an added bonus. If I happen to get a Darksteel Forge down, now I have a 9/9 indestructible commander. That's pretty good. But the ability I want to build around more is the last one. At the beginning of your upkeep, add colorless for each artifact you control. This mana can't be spent to cast non-artifact spells until end of turn. You don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. There's a lot of neat things you can do here. And one of the things that you could do is sort of the opposite of the first ability, right? That's why I don't really want to build around the first ability. The first ability wants you to have big artifacts in play. The last ability wants you to have lots of little artifacts in play. And I think that's the better direction to go. I can put a bunch of artifact tokens into play. And in particular, what I think is neat here and why this guy actually, one of the reasons I have him so high in this list is because I think it's an interesting build around. Another reason is because the more I think about it, the more this guy slots into the 99 of decks. In particular, any deck that is doing clue tokens or maybe food tokens, something like that, because of course those are artifacts, right? If I have a bunch of clue tokens in play, and I might put this guy in my Denic deck maybe because I'm going to have a lot of clue tokens in play. Obviously those clue tokens are artifacts, and I can add a bunch of colorless mana for all the clue tokens I have in play and then use that mana to crack my clue tokens, right? It sort of plays into itself. Food tokens, same thing. Food tokens aren't particularly good. They're only gaining you 3 life. So a lot of people will just leave them lying around. They won't bother to pay the 2 mana to crack them. Here, you're getting that free mana for all of the tokens you have lying around that then you can use to crack those tokens, right? This mana can't be spent to cast non-artifact spells, but you can also use it, of course, for activated abilities. It doesn't say you can't do that, and you obviously can. Stipulation there isn't a bad one. You can't really cast Eldrazi or other colorless spells. Pretty much everything in your deck, though, if you're building this as a commander, you can use that mana to cast. And I really like the activated ability part, right? That's the part that I think makes this an interesting build around. Again, I think it's a great card in the 99 of a lot of decks, but as a build around, I'm going to be looking for artifacts with lots of colorless mana in their activated abilities that I can use this mana to activate. I think this is a pretty neat build around, and I might probably go after this one myself. All right, the number 1 commander for me from this set is Rocco, Street Chef. I just think this is a really neat, interesting commander. Red, green, and a white elf druid 2/4. At the beginning of your end step, each player exiles the top card of their library until your next end step. Each player may play the card they exiled this way. So a little bit of a huggy effect, which I think is a good thing. Giving your opponent that advantage isn't great, but having that on your commander can be a good thing because, of course, because you're giving your opponents an advantage, it's going to make it so that your opponents don't want your commander off the battlefields, right? So they're going to save the removal for the Corvold or the Atraxa on the table. They're not going to use it for your commander, right? So sometimes that can be an advantage there. Whenever a player plays a land from exile or casts a spell from exile, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature and create a food token. So the reason I have this at number 1, there's 2 reasons. One, I think it's an interesting build around. Doing the exile tribal thing, I guess, a little bit. This is whenever a player plays a land from exile or casts a spell from exile. So of course it works on you. You can do impulse draw, play stuff from exile, and get this effect. You also can do the +1/+1 counter theme here a little bit. You can do the food token thing, which of course means you're getting artifact tokens, which I just talked about. You can do some stuff there, and I talked about using like Goblin Welder or something like that. You can use those food tokens for other things because they are artifact tokens. I can put a Bronze Guardian in this deck. There's a creature that's going to be really, really big if I have a whole bunch of food tokens lying around. You can also do the life gain thing here if you want to, right? There's actually quite a few directions you can go with that last ability. But why I put this guy at number 1 is because you don't have to build around anything here at all. I think mostly because there is so much exile tribal already in the format, and we got a couple more. I already talked about some in this video alone. I talked about more exile tribal commanders. And what I mean by exile tribal is I'm just playing stuff from exile, right? I'm doing the impulse draw thing, or you may play that card from exile. You exile that card from a graveyard, copy it, play it from exile. There's so many commanders, like 4 or 5 commanders just from this set alone that are going to trigger your commander, right? That is why this commander is so fantastic in the format, I think. You can just have it sit there, and your opponents are likely going to have at least one person in the game you're playing is probably going to have a commander that is doing that, and it's likely they're going to have a commander like Prosper that is doing that a lot. I mean, can you imagine this guy against a Prosper deck? They're playing stuff from exile like crazy, and you're going to be distributing those +1/+1 counters, creating those food tokens. As the build around here, I think the best way to go is I have to figure out the best way to use those food tokens. Obviously, +1/+1 counters, that's easy. I can just have a Ornithopter Paradise in play, right? There's my Ornithopter Paradise. I'm going to start piling counters on it so I have this giant flyer. I want to find out a great way to use those food tokens. For me, that's the best way to build around this commander because you're going to be spitting them out like crazy. People are going to be playing stuff from exile like crazy, either with that first ability or with whatever else they're doing in their deck. And you got to find a great way to use those food tokens. That to me is the most important part of the build around here. Really, really neat commander. Pretty interesting set overall. I mean, considering we only got 50 cards from this set, I mean, we got some pretty great commanders and we got some pretty great 99 cards as well. I already talked about some of the great 99 cards. You can go check out that video as well if you want to. As I did with my last video, March of the Machines, I will be building one of these commanders. I'm only going to build one because this is only a small set. So I have a poll in the description below. Which commander from this set do you guys want me to build? I will do so. Go vote in that poll. And whichever one is the winner is the commander that I will build and post obviously on my channel. So go do that if you want to see me build one of these commanders. That is it for today though. And thanks for tuning in.